Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. Uh, I know it's been a while. What I want to do today, I've been thinking a lot about structural editing, some of the stuff that I do as part of developmental editing, and how, particularly for first-time authors, sometimes it's a bit daunting. There are a lot of different ways that we can edit a text. There are a lot of different approaches and techniques that we can use. One of the most common, and it's what people do when they alpha or beta or gamma read or whatever sort of advanced reading that they do, is you're reading through and you make a couple of notes about how things are progressing. And that's great. That's great feedback. And the more practiced you get at that, the better your feedback can be, the more comprehensive it can be, and how you put everything together. But when we want to go beyond that, we can think in more structural terms because sometimes with developmental editing, there are aspects of structure that when you explain to someone, it's hard to visualize. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go through one of many, but one approach. And yeah, it starts off very, very blunt, but it can be adapted to become more pointed, more useful, more focused. But it can help as a starting point. For those of you who aren't writers, who are just interested in how narrative is put together, I am going to do a series of videos talking about some structural issues which help us as readers. But part of what I'm about to show here might actually be of interest to you. So when I talk about sort of structural issues and the technique thing that I'm going to show here is probably most useful when there are multiple points of view. And remember, narrator and point of view are different. And so, although quite often we use them almost synonymously, they're not actually the same. The narrator, the narratorial voice is one thing, but the point of view is how the reader is engaging with the text, from what position the reader is getting the narrative. So, an omniscient narrator is a narrator that knows everything, but an omniscient narrator could be in first person, second person, or third person point of view. So, there is a distinction here, and I might go back and do something more about that. But what I want to talk about today, and this is something that comes up with a number of my clients, that their debut novel or the manuscript that they want me to look at is incredibly long. And quite often they've used multiple points of view. And they have an idea that, well, I'm not sure which sections are dragging, which sections are too long, what can I cut, what can't I cut, that it can feel overwhelming because when you've created something, you you know why it's there. You've created this, you can visualize it, and it's very hard to separate out what is necessary for the reader and what is merely something that you created that is great. And it might be great, but it's not necessarily serving the narrative. There is a big, 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 huge, massive difference between serving the narrative and serving the plot. These things are not the same. So, again, very brief aside about this. The narrative is the entire thing. The plot is the sequence of the narrative events as narrated and in the order that they are narrated to the reader. That's what the plot is. The story are these narrative events in chronological order. So you can take a whole sequence of the day starts, all the different events in the day. And if you relayed that to a reader, that would be your narrative, causally linked events in chronological order. And that would be story and plot being synonymous. But if you start moving around and you start in media res, and then you have a flashback to earlier in the morning, then you have more stuff happens, then you have a different flashback to a different point in time, you're moving the chronological order of things. It's no longer A to B to C to D in a nice, neat chronological fashion. You're moving around in time, in which case plot and story are now distinct. But when we talk about in service of the narrative is the overarching thing. So it's going to include character arcs, character development, the beginning, middle, and end of the entire narrative. It's the different points of view, it's the style, it's the events, it's the content, it's the tone. All of these different aspects are part of the narrative. Even things like theme and symbolism and the level of diction, the level of language, these are part of the narrative, but they're not necessarily part of the plot. So when we think in sort of more structural terms, and this is why initially it can seem very blunt. And it is like this is taking a sledgehammer to a first draft. We start by thinking, what are our kernels? What are our satellites? And a kernel is something that must happen. So if we think of the Lord of the Rings, a kernel is Frodo must have the ring because the entire narrative is about Frodo getting rid of it. So if Frodo never gets the ring, none of the other events can happen. But the encounter leaving the Shire, being chased by the Nazgul, is that essential for the narrative? Well, no. As long as Frodo leaves the Shire, it doesn't matter whether or not he gets chased. It's a great sequence. It's a really intriguing sequence. It develops the world, it develops the setting, it develops the stakes, it gives us a sense of threat, it adds stuff to that moment. But if you take out that sequence of the Nazgul chasing Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, if you take that out, you have Frodo in the Shire, then Frodo in Bree. That sequence doesn't need to happen. But if you have Frodo never getting the ring, you cannot have the rest of it. So that's sort of the distinction between a kernel, which must happen for plot and story to function. It is one of the causal events that cannot be changed. It is a fixed point. It must happen. Otherwise, the entire narrative collapses. A satellite, on the other hand, can be a brilliant sequence. It can develop character, it can develop theme, it can develop action or respite or drama or tension. It can do amazing things. But if you removed it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire narrative collapses. So, how do we sort of think about all of these things? And this is what I'm going to show you, this technique. Okay, so what we have here, I have just kind of started to fill this in. And this is a sort of, basically, it's a spreadsheet. I put it in Excel. You can do it as a table in Word, you can do it as notes, you can do it whatever way. I find it useful to do in Excel because there's a whole lot of different calculations that you can do, and you can use pivot tables and pivot graphs in order to visualize the data. But what this essentially is a first pass, bare bones sort of approach, a system of tracking when writing. And this is something I want to point out. If after a writing session, you fill in this data, it'll take a couple of minutes at the end of a writing session. If you wait until you've finished your entire manuscript and then go back to do this, this will take a couple of days. But if you build it up as you go along, it only adds a couple of minutes to every sequence, every scene, every writing sort of session that you have. If you build it up as you go along, it's actually really easy to maintain. And it can be a very useful tool. So if we look just in the top corner, you have your title of your project and the author name. So title of the project, Bookie McBookerson, author McAutherson. You could have the title of the manuscript. You can put in the full detail, like book one, spellbinding series of dragon riders eating rainbows, whatever. And then the title of the book. But you have your title of the project at the top and you put the author name on it, your name on it. Because, you want to keep track of these things. And it's always good just to note this sort of stuff down. And this is why, I do it just because I always like to have documentation of everything that I'm doing and I can keep track of stuff. And then in this field here, you would have your total number of words. And the way that you can do that is you can auto sum the this word count column here and have the auto sum here. So it auto updates. You can also, if you want, I have total number of POVs, total number of different points of view that are being used. Again, that can be an additional column in here, but it's usually relatively limited, particularly when you're noting them down. And so you can either manually sum it or not. Total number of chapters. Why does Microsoft Copilot constantly turn on? Sorry about that. Total number of chapters. And this is a good way to sort of keep track of things because not only have your total number of words, but you have the total number of chapters. If you want, you can put in average number of words per chapter. And again, you can have a simple formula that will average out and show you roughly how long your average is for each chapter. Again, this is not necessary for everyone's book, but it can be useful information to have because you can do a lot with it. And then this is broken down into a number of different headings. Again, these are not all the headings. They're not always going to be relevant for everyone. But a recent project that I was working on, a lot of this stuff came in handy. And you can add more. But chapter number. So chapter 1, chapter 2. The word count in that chapter. So you can fill that in. The scene number. Chapters are typically made up of several scenes. So this helps us have a breakdown of all the different scenes that are within a chapter. So now we can see the number of scenes. And here there's a scene number 1 and it's 1A, and scene 1, but it's 1B, because it's one scene that has been split into two different points of view. So it's the same scene, but it suddenly shifts point of view. So instead of just being two separate scenes, because it's the same scene, it's the same action sequence, but it shifts point of view at a certain point in the action sequence to someone else, in which case it's the same scene, but now it's being shown from a different perspective. So I noted that down as the same scene, but split it into A and B. And that gives me, and I can note down the full word count for that scene and the full word count for this scene. I note down who the POV is or what the POV is. In this case, the POV was from the third person, but it's the main character. And then the second half of the same sequence, the same scene, was from what becomes the sidekick. As a result, I note down those two different POVs. And I note the word count for the main character. So yes, this is going, at this stage, is going to be the same as the word count for this part of the scene. But if we have the main character in here and in here, and then we wanted to know the word count for the main character, we can total these word counts. And as a result, we can then see the number of words that are given to the main character. But that's why noting down who the POV is can be useful, and noting down a separate word count for POV can be useful. This also shows us, here is the very blunt, this is the amount of words in this chapter. Should chapters have a certain word count? No, it's going to be individual to the narrative, to the text. But sometimes you'll find one chapter is huge compared to other chapters. And so even just seeing that raw number, it doesn't necessarily mean that that chapter has to be shorter, but it's immediately obvious that there's something different about this chapter. So then it's a signal to go and look at that and go, does this chapter work better as a huge chapter, or should it or could it be broken up into smaller chapters? What would those effects be? Again, this is about giving us data about the text so that we can better understand all the different elements that are going on. Column here for location or setting. City McSitterson, and it's a tavern and an alleyway within City McSitterson. Same location and setting for the next, for that scene B, because it's happening in the same place. We could also note down date information or time information if we wanted as an additional column. Again, it's all about trying to keep track of things and build up the data as we go along. When you have a meticulous outline and you're filling stuff in, you might have a lot of this stuff mapped out. But quite often during the process of writing, because writing is iterative, even with a very methodical plan and a very detailed outline, there will be moments when you are creating and moving on and exploring. If you're writing by the seat of your pants, if you have a rough destination in mind and you just want to see how you get there, this can be a good way to keep track of things. Because then, should something you suddenly write yourself into a corner, you'll be able to backtrack. You have this summary of all of this data, and you can see where maybe might be a good place to insert something to change or to fiddle instead of just trying to write out of that corner. Sometimes it can mean going back 1 to 5, 20 scenes to insert something, and this helps you keep track of all that. So if you're just creating by the seat of your pants and you just have a rough idea of where you want to go and you're exploring your writing, this can be a good way to track. If you're writing to an outline, again, it can be a good way to note down what you've actually done in that writing session, what you've developed, where you currently are. Keywords for the scene type. So within chapter 1, and we are in scene 1, and the point of view is from the main character, and our location and our setting is in the named city, and it's in this tavern, and it spills into the alleyway as one complete sequence. This is an action sequence. That's it. It's a main action sequence. But we can have other keywords. We might have dramatic. We might dramatic, tragic, sad, angry. Like we can add in a bunch of different keywords. And again, it's just a way of keeping track. A very brief 1 or 2 or 5 keywords. We're not writing sentences here. It's just keywords. Because if we are tracking, this is an action sequence. This is action battle, action duel, to make a difference in a battle with lots of people or a duel in between like 2 people. We might want to make that distinction. But then we can see where if we have action, 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 action for about 20 scenes in a row, we go, is that too much? Is that moving too quickly? Is that too much action all in one place? Again, it helps us note what is there as a way of seeing overall patterns, if patterns are going to emerge. And it's not that you do, oh, I'm going to do action, action, respite, drama, character development, action, action, respite. We don't do it that way. We're not writing to a pattern. What we're doing is we're noting down what has actually been done to see if patterns evolve, if we have accidentally fallen into a particular rhythm. And if we have, is that rhythm working or is it something that needs to be disrupted? So again, it's a way of understanding the writing in a bit more depth. The major elements for plot. So remember I had said there's a distinction between plot and story. So this is if something happens in the scene. How is it important for plot? Not narrative, we're just talking about plot here. And in this case, I said this is the main character's first fight. That's the major element that's being explored here. And then the next part of the scene is the main character's first fight. It's the immediate aftermath. The major elements for character. Well, in this case, it's introducing the main character's fighting ability. And it's also the introduction of the sidekick. These are the 2 major sort of elements. And again, this could be a few words, a couple of sentences, whatever. It's just a brief tag of trying to divide up what each of these things are. It's an action sequence. It's depicting the main character's first fight. Later on, we might have action sequence, main character's first fight against major nemesis, being Philip. We might add a couple of just extra details. What type of fight is it? Major character's first fight hyphen bar brawl. That's all it has to be. Because again, when you're creating a narrative, or even when you're reading and you're looking back on, think of these as notes about something that you're going to review. You'll remember a lot of the stuff that happened. So this is an aid memoir. It's a way of remembering and helping your memory. So when you say first fight, oh, I remember that. I know what fight that is. I know we have the city, we have all of these details. So now when you think about it, you can actually picture a lot of that information. The desired effect or the desired communication or the desired purpose. So why is this scene here? What is its purpose? What is it doing? What is it trying to communicate to the reader? And in this case, this is meant to be engagement. It's meant to be action. It's signaling the genre. It's introducing the main character. We might add it's introducing characteristics of main character, heroic. Summary. Here's a very brief description of what happens in the scene. The main character protects an innocent victim, gets in a fight, shows heroic qualities. So now we see what the scene is meant to be conveying, and we have a summary of what the scene is. Additional notes. It introduces the main character's weapon and the local setting. It feels dynamic, but it's quite abrupt. So these are just additional notes as you're going through, looking at this scene. Let me have a look, things that sort of spring to mind. And then I have a last column here, editorial notes. The stakes are low as a reader, unaware of who the main character is, what the main character is capable of, who the threat is, what the threat is capable of. So I'm noting that while I think this is an introduction of what the character can do, and it's meant to be action and exciting, and it's all of these sorts of things, from an editorial standpoint, it seems to be lacking something because we don't know as a reader what these stakes are. We don't know what this character is capable of. And while this is illustrating some of it, we don't know if this is out of the blue. So this would be if there's an action sequence and a fight, is this a fight that we're meant to think that the main character can lose? Is this a fight that actually the main character can handily win, that this is usually beneath them? And if those are questions, we can add them in as the editorial notes, because then when we go back into editing mode, we can look at that and say, well, with the insert of a sentence here or a couple of words here, or a slight change to the language being used to make it more apprehensive, we can build up the tension that will unconsciously signal to the reader that this is actually threatening. Or if this is meant to be beneath them and they're easily going to win, again, are there signal phrases? Are there signal words? Is there a bit of information that can be dropped in? Does something else need to be highlighted? Does something else need to be focused on? That it's a way of flagging potential issues. It's a way of flagging these things and just making notes as you're going through. So as you can see, when you build this up, as you go through a work in progress, if you're sitting down to write for, let's say, an hour, and you've sat down, you've written for your hour or 50 minutes or 55 minutes, and then you save the document, and you go back and you go to this thing, and you very quickly plug in that information. And again, it only takes a couple of minutes. And if you do this at the end of every writing session, A, it's a great way of tracking progress. But B, it means that you're actually building up this picture. And one of the reasons this can become very useful, if you have multiple points of view, and you have your main character and let's say a secondary character, and the secondary character is almost a secondary main, but they are secondary. There is a main character and there's a secondary character. And then there's a tertiary character and a quaternary character. And you look at the quaternary character, and let's say this is 120,000 words. And that fourth character has 4,000 words in the entire novel. But the main character has 54,000. And then the other two are roughly split, with whatever is left. So what, 20,000 each, roughly. So the main character has nearly 3 times as many words as the next two characters. And then the fourth character has a tiny amount of text. At best, a quarter or a fifth of the secondary characters. We can look at that and say, well, there's very little time spent in this character's point of view. And it's immediately obvious because we can see that raw number. So then we can look at those sequences and go, are those sequences really adding to the narrative? Or is this an extraneous point of view? Is this a point of view that we can lose? If we are losing, what are we losing in those sequences? And we have the full summary of everything. Or we can look at this and see that this shift of point of view to the side character in the middle of this scene. There's a sort of like a little break as it switches point of view. What does that add? Do we need that point of view, or should the entire sequence be from one or the other? How does that affect the sort of balance? And again, raw numbers are raw numbers. Raw numbers are neither an indication that everything is going well or an indication that things are going badly. All it is showing you is the balance of the amount of time that a reader is going to spend in the various points of view. If, in the case of having over 50,000 in one character and like 20,000, 20,000, 10,000 in the other characters, and you wanted this to feel like an ensemble piece, it's hard to feel like an ensemble when there's clearly one point of view that is very heavily favored to the extent it is twice as much. The reader is spending twice as much time with this character. And so by being aware of that, we can track how, in raw terms, in blunt terms, like this is the equivalent of a sledgehammer, but in very broad terms, how a reader is spending time with these characters. And we might want one character constantly dipping in very, very little uh, to have little moments because this is an intriguing character and we don't want to give it away, but it's going to be fun. And so, for instance, a strange mage character who has joined them, and every once in a while they have this little aside where they look at the entire situation differently, and that's giving clues to the reader. So if we look at that and go, well, where are all of those moments? Are they happening regularly? Are a lot of them close together, or are they regularly spaced out? Are they very far apart? It might be a signal or a way to see, well, hang on, there's nothing from this character for over 30,000 words in a 120,000 word novel. 30,000 words go by with nothing from this character, and then suddenly there's a huge amount from this character. Is it possible maybe to break that up, to have more balance? Do we want more balance? Because again, this is raw data. This is not a blueprint. It is not a formula. It is showing us a different way of thinking about the text. Because when we are reading, quite often we get caught up in the moment. This is much less about that. This is about these big patterns. And because of that, it can highlight things that potentially we are missing. Because we're reading a section, we go, this is really exciting. And then suddenly we get to a chapter and we're like, oh, I'd forgotten this person was in it. But when was the last time that they were in it? And that's where this sort of thing comes in handy. It's not that this shows you you must do A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, all the way down. It's not saying that. And if you've fallen into that pattern, you might say, maybe I want to disrupt this because it's becoming too regular. I don't want it to fall into that very patternistic, formulaic sort of structure. I might want to change a couple of things. I might want to do A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, set up that expectation, then do B, D, A, C, D, D, and start playing around with it. Start moving it around to see what sequences can I use? What is going to drive reader interest, drive reader engagement? So looking at this, again, as I've keep saying, this is blunt. This is not how you edit something. But this can be a very useful tool for keeping track of raw data. Um, it is more useful when there are multiple points of view. It is more useful, particularly for debut authors who maybe are not keeping track of when there's an action sequence or when there's a dramatic sequence or when there's a moment of respite, when there's a huge moment of character development. Do we have five major sections of character development all in a row that are taking up 15,000 words and no action in something that started very action heavy and now, oh, look, here's a big section where readers will say nothing happens. And if that's true, if we've set up the expectation of action heavy, if that is the expectation of the genre and style of this book, having a very long section where nothing happens, one of the criticisms I loathe. But if there is that section in place, then it's immediately obvious. Whereas quite often when we're moving through it, we go, oh, but this is what the events are. And so it gives us a different approach. It's a way of thinking about the text differently, from a different perspective. In effect, getting new eyes on it and looking at different things and not getting caught up in the details and the events. And it is not a fix in and of itself, but it can reveal things. And one of a key example of this, and it was a project I did many, many, many years ago, but the author had a sequence of an exciting action sort of sequence and then a moment of lull to recover from it. An exciting action sequence, a moment of lull. An exciting action sequence, a moment of lull. Then there was action sequence, action sequence, action sequence, action sequence, action sequence. So it was a huge chunk suddenly was all action and it became breathless and it became tiring because it just was constant. And then there was a whole section that felt really slow. And the reason it felt slow was that then when character development, world building, character development, world building, moment of respite, characterization, character development. And there was this big long stretch where there weren't any major narrative events. And so to move from something that was rocking along as something happened and oh what happened? Something else has happened. Oh, and constantly moving through to then suddenly having a an incredibly breathless sequence of just action after action after action. And then this long space of time where there weren't any narrative events. And so when reading through this, I'd been making notes about it. And I did this sort of thing up because I had said, you have this issue. And the author quite rightly said, but I had this action sequence and then now I need to do these things. So I brought up this kind of data to show to them. I said, here's where you're doing these things. And then suddenly there's this. And they looked at it and they suddenly just saw this long stretch. And we totaled up the word count so they could see it relative to all these things. Created a graph, showed them a graph of it. And they could see that the pattern wasn't working. It wasn't really what they wanted. And they hadn't realized quite how long that sequence was, even though these were all necessary character development moments. And it's like, right, is there a way to insert some of these earlier? That the rest in that long action sequence or series of action sequences, why don't we take one of these moments and have it happen between these two things? A, that breaks up the breathless rush of the action sequence, but also B, it gives that moment of character development, which is absolutely necessary, but it's putting it now in a place that works better. Similar thing with a completely different author that we were looking at the points of view. And again, it was so heavily skewed towards one point of view. And then halfway through the text, suddenly it became heavily skewed to a totally new character. And the first major character just almost disappeared for over a third of the book and then suddenly reappeared again. And it felt then very unwieldy. It felt that it was weighted strangely. And so by looking at this, it was a way to help other people visualize some of the patterns that we see when we are reading. And to have those raw numbers, to just show the raw numbers and go, this is what you're doing and this is what the pattern is, to have this sort of detail. It meant then that in going back and potentially locating an area in the text where something could be changed that will have a ripple effect for the rest of the text, it's easier to see. So that's why things like this can be incredibly useful, because it's not just, does it serve the story, right? We're not talking about story. Does it serve the narrative? Is it communicating what we want? Is it communicating in the order of events that is going to be most impactful? Is it maintaining interest and engagement? Is equal or near equal time being given to equal or near equal points of view? Or is one of them actually a main character and the main focus? In which case, we need to stop thinking of them as equal points of view. We need to think, no, this is main character and this is supporting and secondary character, because that's how the book actually turned out to be written. Having these things is a way to map it out, in addition to all of the other techniques that people use. And I don't do this for every single text. It takes a couple of days to sit down with a text that you haven't written to go through and do all of these things. But it can be very rewarding. And certainly with some editorial work that I have done, I have had to do this because it's the easiest way that I have found for me to accurately pinpoint moments and changes and things to talk about, rather than constantly reading and rereading and going backwards and forwards through the manuscript to try and locate the thing. That this sometimes is an easy way to do it, because you can set up auto calculations for word count, auto calculations for percentage of time spent with a character, because you can change that POV word count using a pivot graph and create a pivot table, and you can create a pivot graph that shows the percentage relationship. And you can do it as a pie chart and show how much time we're spending with one character visually represented against another. And that can be incredibly useful in understanding elements of the text in front of us. Is it the natural way to approach text? No, no, nothing about this is natural. This is not how we naturally read. But the more that we try to learn about a text, the more that we're approaching it not just as, well, I read it to see if it was fun, which, a lot of us do that. That's one of the reasons why we read. But if we're going to be making comments about pacing, if we're going to be suggesting changes, if we're saying, oh, they made a mistake here, this is the kind of data that can actually be really, really useful. And again, this is blunt data. It has to be placed in the context of the actual content of the narrative. I saw once someone did, here's the average length of a sentence in these books, as if this was in some way a major revelation about these books. And how they sampled the text that they used for these different authors was horrendously flawed. It was a really bad sampling method because it wasn't paying attention to the context of the sequence. Because when we think of an action sequence, mid-action sequence, the author may have increased pacing. If the author has increased pacing, one of the ways that authors routinely do this, short words, shorter sentences, lots of rapid fire sentences. If we have a sequence that has been running long in terms of description or even in exposition, that is creating a sense of something, the author may be adding in dialogue because that breaks up the page. And it means then that the reader is spending roughly the same amount of time on a page because they suddenly get to a dialogue section that's been extended to reduce the amount of time they're spending on that page. So they don't feel that they're spending a huge amount of time on the page because it's roughly the same page, word count to the page, as opposed to one that's in shorter paragraphs, but alternating sentence lengths. So description and exposition, character point of view, whether or not it's an action sequence, whether it's a moment of respite, what's happening in the text. All of these things can significantly impact sentence length. So we don't just look at the raw number and go, number prove. No. It's an additional piece of information that we then apply to the complicated context of the actual narrative. It gives us additional information. It is not the be all and end all. And so, even if a character is dominating a word count in a novel, that is A, not necessarily a bad thing. B, it's not necessarily a good thing. C, it might even show that while we're spending a huge amount of time with this character, actually the most impactful and eventful sequences are from a different character's point of view, in which case, maybe that other character needs a lot of that trimmed away. There are so many different ways to interpret the data. It's always a tool that goes with other forms of analysis. It is not the be all and end all. And we have to be aware of the type of scene, the point of view being used. And we even have to be aware of the intended audience. If someone is writing for adults, or someone is writing for YA, or someone is writing for children, the level of diction, the level of complication of a sentence, that can all be different. Doesn't always have to be, but it can be, in which case we need to pay attention to that. So while I think this is a useful tool for a lot of authors, particularly those who struggle with keeping track of what they have created, um, or even those who want to see how things are advancing. And I think it's a very useful tool for authors to develop in their own way, use their own columns, do whatever they want to do. But it helps them keep track of stuff. And if it is updated at the end of every writing session, then it's simple, it's straightforward, and it's not onerous. And at the end of it, you have this additional document, which is showing you a lot of the raw bones, the skeleton of the narrative that's been created. And it's showing it in a way that we're not used to, in which case that information can be really useful in seeing patterns that we are blinded to because when we are reading, we get caught up in the scene or we get caught up in, oh yeah, but the character must do this and the character, of course, feels this way. It's a way of temporarily sidestepping that to look at the overall pattern of the overall narrative, not just the scene, not just the chapter, not just what's important to the character, but the overall narrative, the thing that the reader is going to be invested in. It's this additional technique. So, hopefully, that has been of interest to at least some of you. Um, if it has, it'd be nice to hear from you. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.